Let us move on to the first basic pattern, which is a square. The first step would be to divide the given pattern into rows and columns. So this is how it is going to look after you divide the pattern in the form of rows and columns. That is basically you're representing the entire pattern in a matrix format. Now the second step would be to label the rows and columns. Let us label the rows as R0, R1, R2 and R3 and columns as C0, C1, C2 and C3. Now here we are assuming that the user's input is the number of rows R, or it might be even the number of columns. Why? Because in any pattern which is a square here, the number of rows is equal to the number of columns. This is an important thing that you need to remember about squares. So the input can be either the number of rows or the number of columns. There is one more important point that you need to remember here. To print any pattern which is represented in the form of rows and columns, you need two loops. One to traverse across the rows and one to traverse across different columns. Let us move on to the next step. As I told you, to print any pattern which can be represented in a matrix format, you need two loops. The first outer loop is used to travel across rows, that is vertically downwards. The second inner loop to travel across the column, that is horizontally across. So this is how it's going to work. So the first loop R0, you're going to go to C0 and print, then C1 print, C2 print and column 3 print. Next you're going to traverse to the different row, that is R1. Then again you're going to go to C0, C1, C2, C3 and so on. These are the other important steps that you need to follow. Now comes in the analysis part. Now we have assumed that the input, that is the number of rows or the number of columns, is equal to 4. So here we clearly know that the column loop should run 4 times and the row loop should also run 4 times. Please don't get confused when I say 4 times. It is not the labeling of the columns or labeling of the rows. It is how many times a loop should actually run. And here you can either start the labeling of columns and rows from C0 or from C1. If it is from C1, it goes all the way up to C4. If it is from C0, it goes all the way up to n-1, that is C3. Now let us write the logic to print this particular pattern, which is going to be represented in the form of rows and columns. Now you need to write the locations of all the stars. So the first star's location is R0 and C0. The second star's location is R0 and C1. Again, the third star's location is R0 and C2. Fourth star's location is R0 and C3. As you can see here, we have completely described the location of the first particular row. Now moving on to the second row, R1, C0, C1, C2, C3. Now moving on to the next row, R2, R2, C0, C1, C2, C3. R3, C0, C1, C2 and C3. So we have described the location of all the patterns here. Now let us actually analyze the loop pattern. So the outer row loop runs from 0 to 3. When I say 0 to 3, 0, 1, 2, 3, it is running 4 times. Now the inner column loop is also running 4 times, that is C0, C1, C2 and C3. So when R is equal to 0 and C is equal to 0, a star is being printed here. R is equal to 0, C is equal to 1, print another star. R is equal to 0, C is equal to 2, print another star and so on. Now this is going to be the logic to print this entire pattern. As I told you earlier, we are going to use two loops. One is to loop around the different rows, which is the outermost loop, and the second would be to loop around all the columns, which is going to be the innermost loop. So let us take in a variable. Here we are taking in small r as a variable. It is going to start from 0 and it is going to go up to n. Remember, it is less than n. If we are going to start from 1, it will be less than or equal to n. Please remember this. This is a very important concept here. The same thing applies for the inner column loop as well. We have considered small c as a variable here, which is going to start from 0 and it is going to go all the way up to n, but not equal to n. That is why it is less than here. Now we are going to print the pattern, and we are going to have one more print statement outside the column loop in order to come to the next line. As you can see here, when r is 0, c is 0, print. When r is 0, c will be 1, print. c2 print, c3 print. Now when c is equal to 4, 4 is not less than 4. So you got to break out. So from here, what is the next thing that has to be executed? The printf statement. This \n goes to the next line. So from here, it comes here and it moves on to the next row. Again, r will be equal to 1 here. C will go from 0 to 3. Come out, print the new line character and print again. So this is the logic to print a square pattern.